right. Welcome, everybody. This is our Bay Area Nature Journal Club workshop. Today what we're going to be doing is taking a look at drawing and sketching landscapes. I want to welcome you to the Bay Area Nature Journal Club's landscape drawing workshop. When we're out in the field, we have lots of great opportunities to draw and sketch natural landscapes. And that's not the time you want to be hearing a lecture and hear some of the theory behind it. It's when you want to be drawing up a storm. So what I wanted to do today is show you part of the conceptual framework that I find has really helped me be able to draw and sketch the landscapes that I see when I'm out there. And so this is landscape drawing in theory. This, attached with some getting out in the field and really trying this and applying it yourself, is what's going to make a big difference. Not all of the ideas that I'm going to show you today are going to really work for you, but what I want you to do is absorb what is useful and see if there's a few little pearls, nuggets that you get out of today that you can really take and apply into what you're doing. Right? And most importantly, make it fun. Sometimes we think when we're drawing this landscape, we have to make this beautiful portrait of a place. Be playful with it, enjoy it, goof around with it, and experiment with, we're going to see a number of different techniques today. You can play with those and see what really works for you. And you might find that that makes it a lot easier to take what you see out there and get it down onto the page. This is a painting by Bierstadt, who is a wonderful California landscape painter. But I think this is also one of the reasons why, for a long time, I had a lot of trouble with landscape drawing. Because when I would go out into the field and want to draw a landscape, I'd sit down someplace and say, oh, this is beautiful, I want to draw this now. I would think that, all right, I want to do a landscape, and so I think big. Right? I'm thinking, I need to now make some enormous canvas. So I take my journal and turn it sideways so that the paper is longer. And I'd start with whatever amount interests me, and I would start drawing until I get to the edge of the paper, and then go out in all directions. And it took a long time. And invariably, like a quarter of the way through it, I'd be sitting there thinking, like, I'm so sick of drawing trees. All right? You know, there's one tree, here's another tree, here's another tree, here's another tree, here's another tree. It took a tremendous amount of time. Or if I was traveling with other people, they'd be hiking along and we'd stop for lunch and I'd start doing a landscape. They finish their lunches, they're ready to go, and I'm just beginning. Or if I'm by myself, by the time I get done doing the landscape, my tailbone is so sore from sitting on the rock. So what I have come to start, the way I think about landscapes now, is rather than go big, what you want to do is the concept of the landscapito. Landscapito just means little tiny landscapes. And I will now I've switched to these little landscapes, and I find them so much more fun than these big, intimidating, giant, stretch across the page landscapes. You'll also see in a moment some of the bonuses of doing this. I literally am making landscape drawings in my journal that are this big. Right? And if this is my journal page, what I can do is I can make a series of these on one page of different sizes, different shapes. And in the same amount of time it would take me to do one big landscape, I can get multiples of these little ones. And that actually gives me a much better impression of the place that I'm in. And there's a couple of other really important strengths of doing these little landscapes that I want to take a close look at. And the first is that because it's little, because it's a landscapito, it is much easier to do these things. If this is the size of my landscape, let's say that this takes me, I don't know how many minutes to do. It might take you either 5 to 10 minutes to do something this big. All right, let's say go on the long side, 10 minutes. If you double the size of this drawing, how long does it take you to do?
4 times as long.
4 times as long. It's not twice as long. There's 4 times as much area here. Right? It's going up by the square. Right? So if I do it 3 times long, I've got 9 times more work. Or if I make it 4 times, I've got 16 times more work to do now. And this takes forever. So what is that? 160 minutes now. That's a lot of turf to cover. The landscape beat, though, because it's small, allows you to really crank a lot of stuff in a short period of time. Another nice thing about the landscape beat, though, is that it allows us to focus our composition, to control the composition of our drawings in a very different way. Here's your journal. Right? Say we're drawing on this page. Here's the way that I used to do things. I'd sit down in front of this mountain and go like, oh man, I want to do a landscape. That's the mountain I want to draw. So I go, all right, there's the mountain. All right, and here is this little mountain next to it, and there's a little ridge coming up here. There's trees in front of it. And I would do something that would stretch from one side of the page to the other side of the page. And there might be a little river coming down here. And there are 2 letter M's in the sky. What are they doing up there? I don't know. Oh, V's, right? I would stop drawing when I ran out of room. I would stop drawing when I got to the edge of the page. Does that sound familiar? See, what's just happened here is that the size of the page controls my composition. The balance of what's in and what's out of the picture, the composition of it, makes a picture interesting or not. This way, when I start with whatever I'm interested in, very often I get the focus of my attention right there in the middle of my page. Even if I don't, the edges of it are going to be defined by when I run out of paper. Instead, with the landscape eco, what I do is I frame what it is I want to draw. I look at the shape of that square. And then I'm going to Yosemite Valley over here. I was going to draw half over here. I ran out of paper before I hit half fill. And you don't have that problem with the landscape eco. You control the composition, your page doesn't. Let's take a closer look at composition itself, because there's a few tricks that when I say get a good composition, what I'm basically talking about is one way or another of avoiding this problem. Right? Here I have, it's a tree. It's a tree right in the middle of the picture. This is a static, I would say a boring, an uninteresting composition. If you look at sort of studies of what people's eyes do when they look at something like this, they kind of look at the tree. And they go, yeah, I got it. And then they look away. There is a tremendous amount of symmetry here. I have my tree in the middle. I have a comma of blue over here, same size as a comma of blue over here. I have a rectangle of blue back here. It's about the same size as the rectangle of the green down here. Same, plonked right in the middle. This kind of symmetry is static in our brains and not as interesting. If you take the center of your interest and you put it off the center a little bit, you start to play with the sizes and proportions of the different elements around your picture, and you get variation of those, it becomes much, much more interesting. So now I have this size versus this size. I have this shape here versus this shape. I have this off on the side balanced by a long beam out here. This is a teeter-totter. There's my tree on it. I have my tree over here balanced by this big space out over here. I can still have a balanced painting that's not symmetrical. This is much more dynamic. This is much more interesting. And what are some structures that we can have in our head to help us kind of put this sort of graphic variation into our pictures? This is what I'm trying to avoid. Same. Right? So I have 3 objects, same size. The spacing between them, the same. The spacing up here, same as that. Spacing here, same as that. Same, not very interesting. This is much more dynamic and interesting. I have objects of different size. This one is cutting, is overlapping, going outside the frame. These are overlapping each other. Here, notice that the white space itself even becomes a dynamic part of this picture. What can you do to kind of help yourself get away from this sort of a composition? What can you do to sort of get from this so that something like this is more natural, that kind of comes out the end of your pencil? What I did here is I'm going to show you one trick that is, it's one approach that people will use to kind of play with their composition sense. This is not a rule of composition. Right? There aren't rules in this. These are just some guidelines. And what a lot of people have found that helps is they'll just throw a little tic-tac-toe grid over their picture frame and use the horizontals and verticals and the intersections here to help them place the elements. So this ball down here, I placed that one over the intersection of one of those grid points. That line up there is at a third line up there. Is there anything that's magical about thirds? No. But this, looking at these locations for major vertical elements, or my cliff comes down here and comes across this plane, it's basically ways of just helping you not do this so much. This is what, it's really easy to gravitate towards this. So even some digital cameras now, when you push the button down, they'll flash this little grid onto the screen that you're looking at, just to kind of help the photographer go like, oh, maybe I shouldn't put the person I'm taking a picture of right there in the center. Right? So if you, it's just another way of helping prevent doing this. Right? Ooh, it's half dome. Kerplop. Right there in the middle of the picture. Right? It is lost in all of this other stuff. It's also not a very dynamic picture. If I take that little tic-tac-toe board and just throw it, I could throw that over this picture in several different ways and kind of work different boundaries around here. Here's just sort of one of them. And I'm going to put the horizontal third right here along that mountain line that I see. I'm going to center one of those tic-tac-toe, those little intersections over half dome. And what I get is this. And that's a more elegant composition. I've got an area of focus that's pulling me in here. Here's half dome, but it's not off there in the center. Here I'm really interested in the texture of these rocks in here. So I put in this, this third up here. The sky wasn't very interesting to me today, so I put in more rock. If there were beautiful clouds, I could have done it this way and also gotten an interesting composition. I'm just trying to find one way I can prevent myself from doing that. That little tic-tac-toe board is one way of doing that. There's another sort of mental framework that you can use to help you get away from this very static composition. And I'll often hold this other idea in my head. So one is this sort of tic-tac-toe thing. Again, you're not wedded to it. You don't have to do it. It's not a rule. It's a little guideline, just a suggestion to make your composition more interesting. Here's another one. It's the three bears. Or mostly, some, and a little. Here they are. Right? If when I'm looking at a composition, if my drawing is mostly, let's take value for instance. Let's say it's mostly dark with some gray and a little bit of white accent. Right? Instead of equal portions of each of those, that's going to be more interesting and dynamic. Or it could be, here it's mostly blue, some light white tan mountain going across, and a little bit of black. Right? By playing with the proportions of these elements in your drawing, this mostly, some, and a little, right? So it's mostly there's some and a little of some other element. That can be thinking about the sizes of elements in your picture. Right? We are mostly with some and a little. Right? Instead of these different parts all being the same size. Mostly some and a little, very, very helpful way of thinking about improving our composition. So those are just a handful of tricks you can hold in your head. And I find that when I'm drawing, just having those back here, again, not rules, they're guidelines. That helps my compositions come out more easily on the page in front. So let's make that sort of the close of part one. That's about a half an hour. Any questions before we move on from composition?
Where were you 100 years ago in my 7th grade art class?
Yeah, really, I wish this stuff was
We're
taught
waiting
so
for an
much.
answer here. No, I'm just kidding.
I wish this stuff was taught so much sooner, you know, like when I mean, these girls are just getting so much out of it, I'm sure.
Oh, but wait, there's more. Now, I gotta warn you. Here's the warning. Today, it's gonna be kind of like drinking through a fire hose. There's gonna be a lot of stuff coming at you. All right?
We can do
So
it.
buckle your seatbelt, because here we go. Are you ready? The idea of having a foreground, a middle ground, and a background in your drawing is an artificial construction, but it is really useful. Of course, there aren't 3 zones when you're looking out in a place. There's an infinite number of little distances. But it actually becomes very useful to separate out in your brain a landscape that you're looking at into 3 zones. Why 3? Because 4 is too many and 2 is not enough. When I look at a landscape, here this one sort of naturally with this pond here breaks itself into sort of foreground, middle ground, background. But it doesn't, you could have 50 little ones. But what's going to happen is when we're doing our drawing, we are going to be drawing differently. The way we draw in the foreground is going to be different than the way we draw in the background. And I'm going to show you a handful of tricks to get depth in your picture. Right? And in order to get if you draw the same way in all these zones, your drawing will look flat. If you draw differently, foreground, middle ground, background, your drawing will have a sense of depth in it. And I'll show you what those tricks are in just a minute. The reason I find 3 is really useful is that the minute I get into 4, there's just like too much for my brain to juggle. I'm like, how different. But if I know, if I can identify a concrete difference between the way I see objects in the foreground versus the background, I can handle those 2. And then for the middle ground, I'm just going to do something kind of in between those. Right? So it becomes a useful way of doing it. And where you draw your boundaries is really, take a look at this photo. For yourself, choose where you would draw your own boundaries in. For foreground, middle ground, and background. And you could do it a bunch of different ways. For me, what I would probably do is this is my foreground. My middle ground, I'm going to grab this hill and these trees that are out here. And the background, I'm going to have all this stuff out here in my sky. So foreground, middle ground, background. I could have done this also as middle ground. It's going to be up to you. But what I want to do now is show you how in each one of these zones we're going to draw things differently to allow you to get a magical sense of depth in your drawing. What you're going to be doing is fooling the viewer into looking at your drawing and thinking that they see depth in this place that really is just a flat page. You're going to fool them into seeing depth on the page. And to do this, there's a number of tricks or things that are different between how you see things that are close to you versus far away. And you know a lot of them already. And what we're going to do here, though, is we're going to put these in a list So you actually have this little worksheet, a checklist of the factors that give you depth in a drawing. You don't have to use all of them in every drawing, but if your drawing looks flat, like something on the side of an Egyptian pyramid, then you can use this list to kind of look at it, like what's working against me here that's flattening this out? And what other factors could I use here to bring into play to give more of a sense of depth? Right? So here's the way the chart's going to look. We're going to have the trick, or the technique, then it's going to be foreground and background. And what we'll do is we'll put in the name of the thing here, show what it's like in the foreground versus the background. The next one, foreground, background, next one, foreground, background. All right? But let's just sort of scan our brains for a second. What are things that you already know are different about the way that things look in the foreground versus the background? What is already, let's just sort of check in with what we know already.
The details is more happening.
Excellent. Lena says the detail. All right, and there's more where?
In the foreground.
All right, so there's lots here, and there's less in the background. Absolutely. What else?
Things are darker closer to you and lighter further away.
Value, so darker closer and lighter further away.
And saturation and contrast.
All right, so saturation, contrast. So we'll take a look at both of these.
And color temperature.
Color, temperature. We're going to be defining these. So anything else we can think of?
Perspective.
Perspective. So that means, so lines, we think of lines coming closer together, and that means that the size of objects, right? So size, usually when we're thinking of perspective, we're thinking of the change in the size. So there's a bunch of different things. And what I'm going to do is, I'm going to go in the order that I have them in my slideshow already. Ready? But you mentioned size, so we're going to start with that one. All right? And this is a really intuitive one. There's an object, it's closer to me, I see it bigger. The further away it is, the smaller it is. Sometimes there happens to be a really big object, a big tree farther away and a small tree close to me. And that can be really confusing. And so artists can deal with in two ways. You can either not include one of those trees. Is it okay to leave something out of your drawing? Yes, it actually is. Every drawing, you're making editorial decisions there. You can't have everything in it. Sometimes people will edit out entire trees. The other is you can use these other tricks. If you want that tree in there, you can use these other tricks and techniques to get that sense of depth in spite of having that confusing tree in there. So size is a really big one. Big tree, smaller tree, even smaller trees allows us to sort of see depth going back there. Also take a look at what's going on in the clouds in the sky. So just as we have on the ground plane, we are getting smaller as we go back there. In the sky, we see the same thing happening. Lena mentioned the next one, detail. Close to us, there is a lot of detail. As you go further back in space, you see less detail. For a lot of us, we think a drawing is done when we take the same amount of detail and we cover the entire drawing with as much detail as we can get. When we do that, we flatten our picture out. And the reason is we are not seeing as much detail in the background. So when we put a lot of detail into the background, we flatten our drawing out. So detail is a spice to be used sparingly, sprinkled on the stuff in the foreground. As you drop back in space, less and less and less and less detail. Until finally you're back here, no detail at all. And you mentioned the dark light contrast. Right? As you go back in space, you're looking through a lot of atmosphere. And the atmosphere has little water droplets in it. Water droplets scatter sunlight. And what that does is makes a hazy filter between you and whatever you are seeing back there. So as you look out in space, as you look back, things get increasingly pale as you drop back into space. So if I'm making my little chart, I would put, close, we've got dark, further away, we've got light. That's the general value of what's going on. But Ashok mentioned something really interesting. He also said contrast. We already have value. And he said, separately from that, there's also contrast. Contrast is there's a subtle distinction that we're going to make from just sort of getting darker as you go back. And let's take a look at what contrast is. Contrast is the difference between light and dark. In each of these zones as I'm going back, I'm looking at how dark is the darkest point and how light is the lightest point. As I go back into space, the dark is going to get lighter. But also what's interesting is the light part gets a little bit duskier, darker. My brightest whites and my darkest darks are usually going to be in those elements that are right up there close to me. And so going back to this same picture here, let's take a look at this close branch in front of us. I see dark branch. Look at the sunlight reflecting off these leaves. Same kind of trees are growing back here, but I don't have as dark and I don't have as white. Back here, look at this, as we go, just even on this hillside here, as we go back in space, look at the difference between dark and light get less and less. So you're out here, very little contrast between dark and light. And out here, none at all. So contrast, so on my little chart, what you might do for contrast, you can make the little, like the contrast buttons on your computer. All right. You still may have light and dark in the background, but the darks aren't going to be as dark and the lights aren't going to be as light. But wait, there's more. This is a fun one. Let's say you're out in the middle of the bigger, let's say there is that bigger object further away. What are my clues here that I'm looking at, not two objects that are the same size, but that I actually have a smaller one closer to me and a bigger one further away? Position on the page. The position on the page. Look at this. All right. As I go closer to the horizon, the further back I get, the further back I'm going on. The higher I get on the page, the further back I'm going in space. So the closer you are to this horizon line, if I had a little friend who's standing back here, that person is even further back than this. Big person. So let's take a look at how that looks in some real photographs. As you go towards the horizon, look at where the height off the bottom here, that the bases of each of these trees comes in. And as the higher you go, you're looking at trees that are further back. And this is kind of an interesting one over here. Look, here we even have that case of what if there's a smaller tree that's in front? Look, here's a smaller tree in front. How do we know it's in front, even though it's smaller? It attaches to the ground here. This tree attaches to the ground there. The base height is an incredibly useful, powerful tool for us as illustrators. And here it is, flat plane of the San Francisco Bay here. I know that these are closer than those because of where they intersect the water. I know that these are even further back. I know that this is even further back than that, and that the city of San Francisco back here is even further, because of base height. So you're out there sketching. This is something that you now know is going to be different. On your little notes, here's a great way of sort of writing this in. You can make a little box like this, and in the foreground area, you can have a tree coming down like this. And in the background, just as base height works toward, we get further back towards the horizon on the ground plane, the same thing happens in the sky. The closer you get towards the horizon, the further back you go. Whether you're going this direction or this direction. So here's the base of this cloud, that's close to me. Here's the base of the next cloud. That's a little bit further back. These clouds are even further back, and these clouds are even further back. The closer you get to that horizon, the further back you go. In the sky plane and in the ground plane. Are there any questions so far? But wait, there's more. We're going to start taking a look at what color does. Ashok mentioned color temperature. Let's take a look at what... Now, color temperature, this is sort of a strange term. Colors don't... The idea of color temperature is a weird one. If you kind of look at physics, blue ends up being a really hot color. You know, you can heat... Like a blue star is super hot. A red star is a cool star. But we call these warm colors. We call these blue things, green things, cool colors. Maybe this reminds us of ice, and this reminds us of fire. But those are just the terminology that sort of come down that a lot of artists use. They say warm colors, cool colors. When we're looking out into space at a distant landscape, we talked about that scattered light there. Those little water droplets scattering light. Well, it turns out that the size of those water droplets is just perfect for scattering, not just scattering light, but preferentially scattering the blue wavelengths of light. And so what that means is that as you go back in space, you're looking through a blue filter. And things that you look at, things that you see, are going through an increasingly strong blue filter. Here's that same photograph. Look here, you can see these sort of warm yellows and these warm greens. Then we drop back to these trees behind us, and it's more of a blue cast to it. Even more strong back here. Very damp, hazy day. So quickly we're getting that sort of filter of the scattered blue light. But look at how the yellows drop out here. Even in this hillside here, look at what happens from this side up close here until I go farther away. And you can see the warm colors dropping out. So it's not, that's why we have the Blue Ridge Mountains, very moist environment, lots of blue scattered light. Purple Mountain Majesties, same sort of thing going on. Right? That's our scattered blue light. Those distant blue mountains, you actually are seeing them with a color shift. Here, warm colors close, cool colors farther away. And here, I also want to sort of think about the clarity with which you're going to see colors. If I have a red object that is close to me, a blue object that is close to me, there's not a lot of scattered light there, I'm going to see these as pure colors. The further that those are away from me, then it can be not just scattered blue light from the water vapor. I can have smog in the air. I can have dust storms, I can have volcanic ash, I can have just stuff in the air that is going to mute those colors as they get further away from it. So the colors are going to go from really intense, saturated colors, as Ashoka was saying, to more muted colors as I go further back. Look at these sort of warm yellows in these grasses here. You compare those with this in the middle ground here. Right? The intensity of that color has dropped. The greens that are here in this forest have been muted back to a grayish, greenish brown. So as you go back in space, the intensity, the sort of the pureness of these colors that you're looking at, those are going to be degraded as well. This is one of those points that is kind of so obvious, most people don't mention it. But if you have two objects and one is closer to you and they overlap each other, you see all of the one that's close to you, and the one that's behind, you don't see all of it. Right? But artists really don't take enough advantage of this as we should. Let me show you a photograph that gives a sort of suggestion of why. Now, okay, I can see that this rock is clearly in front of that rock. Overlap helps me see the relationships between those very clearly. Right? But over here on this side, I know that this rock is closer because of base height. Right? If this photographer had gone down just a little bit lower, then this rock would have overlapped over that one, and their relationship would be much clearer. Right now, this rock seems to be stopping right at that point there. This is a very confusing thing in art. That's what's called a tangent. When it looks like the rock is holding up the water, like a table. If you got down a little bit further, then, rather than that tangent, the ocean would be like that. You would have a clear overlap. And that explains the spatial relationship between these things much more strongly. So very often when I'm setting up a sketch to draw, I'll be kind of moving around and moving up and down. And part of what I'm doing is I'm playing with where I want things to overlap, because I want to be really intentional about getting that overlap to work for me. Here, Yosemite Valley, these are in front, overlap tells me that. I then have this overlapping this, overlapping this, overlapping this. Right? The more zones that are overlapping in a sketch, the more depth you'll get. So a sketch that is like this, here is my mountain number 1, mountain number 2, right? Overlap is telling me nothing about the relationship between these. I just move a few yards over this direction, and I change my relationship to those two objects. I now see that there's more depth in my picture because of overlap. I'm drawing a cluster of flowers. Here's flower number 1, here's flower number 2. Overlap is not telling me anything. I move around to a slightly different position, and my drawing immediately has more depth in it because of overlap. So be intentional about where you're framing your shot from and make that work for you. All of the phenomena, there's one more phenomenon that we have here that allows you to sort of see depth, and I don't have slides for it because I only thought about including this yesterday morning when I was in the shower. And I was thinking about this talk, and sometimes these ideas sort of come to you when you're not working on your program. But in future incarnations of this talk, we'll see this. And here's what it is. You're sitting there looking out at a lake. You can see the close lake shore, the far lake shore. What a lot of people will do, I'll see a lot of landscape drawings like this. Here's this, the close shore here, And over on the other side, I can see the far shore of one. And my guess is that probably this is not what that person is actually seeing. And the reason has to do with how ellipses change shape as they move back in space. Right? If I am standing on a circle and I look down on it, I look down at my feet and I see this. I look at a manhole cover that's out there, and I'm going to see this. I look at one that's out there, higher up, closer to the horizon. The closer to the horizon, the flatter it gets. When you're looking out at the close edge of the lake, you are looking at a side of a ellipse like this. So you might actually be able to see some curve in the side that's closer to you. But you start looking out there across the lake, that's so far away, it's as if you were looking at this top edge of that far thing. So rather than that, it's often almost straight across. So there we go. That's my other side of the lake, and I've got little trees over here. The further away it is, the flatter you'll see it. You're looking at a duck sitting out on the water. Here's my duck. Wow, what a duck. I got a slightly better duck.
There you go.
All right. If it's a far away duck, you'll see it like that. If it's a close-up duck, you'll see it like that. That's where the water line is going to cut across it. Same principle of looking down to see that curve. Further out this way, I'm seeing it as a straight line. There's a post sticking in the water far away. There's one in the water closer to me. I see that curve. That's another way of suggesting depth. I think we probably are going to see it most when we're drawing lakes. So just be aware that even though your brain knows we're in a round pond, and that makes you want to round the opposite edge of that lake, that's how it looks from above. From where you're sitting, it's flat. The good news is there's only 2 other items on this list. Right? There's a lot of things on this list, aren't there? There's a lot of different ways you can show depth. The power of thinking of them this way as a list is that it's easier to remember them, and you can then use it as a checklist. If the drawing's flattening out for you, you can use this to get more of a sense of depth in your picture and bring dimension back into it. And see, these last 2 are more artifacts of the way that we draw. And the first one is line, how we use our line. The line is essentially a very useful line that we artists use a lot to describe the shapes of things around us. If you look at me up here, when somebody draws a picture of me, they draw a line around here, a line here. There is no real line there. You're seeing a change in contrast and color. There's no line around me, but we represent that change in contrast by drawing a little line. Here's Jack. Right? But there actually is no line there. It's useful, though, to draw, and so I use a lot of lines. But the way in which we think about lines has a lot to do with the way we see shapes out in nature. If distant shapes get pale, a pale line we also perceive as being distant. So the more pale, the lighter I make my lines. For lines out in the background, I want to make those pale. Also, you think of like the telephone pole that's close to you, you see it as big, that gets smaller the further you get away. Thick lines pop forward, thin lines recede. Bold, dark lines pop forward, pale lines recede. So the way you use your lines can actually get a sense of depth in the picture. We talked a little bit about that when we were doing our workshop on drawing leaves and petals that were coming towards you. How if there is this leaf that is coming towards you, and you sort of strengthen that part that is right there and the part that is dipping towards you, that pulls that part forward. This is true for landscape drawings, not just plants. You see it everywhere. So that's one. So foreground, bold line, background, light line. And there's one more. And this is a playful one that you can have a lot of fun with. I like this a lot. You start drawing a lot of landscapes, you're going to be drawing a lot of these little rectangles. And eventually you're going to get sick of the rectangle and want to break out of that box. Breaking the box is your prerogative as an artist, and you can do it as much as you want, whenever you want. If you take some element in the picture and it busts out of that picture frame, that will often be perceived as something that is in front of all this other sort of stuff. And so sometimes what I'll do is I'll make a drawing of a wildflower. Here's my wildflower, right? And then I look around and say, oh, I'd like to do a landscape drawing in this area. You just put that landscape drawing back here, slightly overlapping that wildflower, and all of a sudden there's a story that's being told between the two. Or you've drawn your little bird. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll just put in a little landscape drawing behind that bird, and all of a sudden there's this conversation between those two. It's a lot of fun. So any element, here's my box, and let's say I've got a tree that pops out of that box. That's going to be then seen as being really, really close to you. It pops out. It's like this is the stage back here, and the actor is in front of it. You can be really theatrical and have a lot of fun with that. We've looked at a long checklist of things that are different foreground and background. The way that I use these is when I'm drawing, I don't have to use them all in a picture, but I can use them selectively. And or if a drawing is looking flat to me, I'll say like, what's really working against me? Like, oh, it's that I have that really big tree in the background. What am I else going to do here to kind of fight against that, to kind of get a sense of depth back into the picture? I now know the factors that flatten out a picture. I know the factors that can bring depth back into it. And I can put those into any little drawing. It's a lot of fun to do. Let's close that for video number 2. Does anybody have any questions?
You were saying, you could play some tricks with moving around to change the position of things so that you've framed them such that something in front of something else stands out as being in front of that thing. If you're drawing and you've done quite a bit, and then you come up on something that you need to do that with, do you ever trap yourself so that because you've moved something here that it messed up everything over there? You know what I mean?
So what I usually do is I first kind of get those elements sort of majorly kind of overlapped, and then I'll sort of work most of that out before I start drawing. But often I will find myself drawing along, and this just happened to me yesterday, or the day before yesterday. I was drawing an iris, and I had, from the angle that I was sitting, I had this one petal that came up like this, right? And I had this other petal that came up that was like this. So these two things were kind of sharing an edge right along here. And this one was closer to me, but because of the way that these things were set up, you really couldn't see that. And this was a really confusing thing. From the spot that I was sitting, that's how it looked. So what I did is I cheated. And what I did is for drawing this other petal, I just kind of moved my head a little bit to the side, and I got something that looked like this. So that you could see that this one was clearly behind the other one. And it helped get a lot more of a sense of depth in it. So sometimes I'll kind of, tweak the world around, because what I'm trying to do is help the viewer understand the structure that I'm seeing. And if I had done it the way that I saw it, it would have ended up being actually a more confusing picture. Does that help?
Yeah.
Did that answer the question?
Well, yes and no. What I meant was, if you fix that right there, do you ever then realize that, oh, because I did that, it must have something else I drew in that same flower or some other part of the picture?
Sometimes I might like the composition over here and I move to get this part, and then I move to get this. Usually when I'm moving around like that, I'm doing that before I'm actually starting the picture.
Okay.
So I'm not, while I'm drawing, now I'm going to move over here, get that rock in a different place. Because things will move, all these other things move so dramatically. So I'll usually just kind of line it up initially, and then do that. All right. And then, part 3. So there's a ton of stuff coming at you today. But I wanted to talk today also a little bit about value. Value is the difference between dark and light. And in these little landscape sketches, it is really, really easy to get areas of tone and value in that can cover a big section of it. Because it's a small thing, if you're trying to fill in an area that's dark, that's this big, right? You're doing this, and then your pencil marks are overlapping, it's making a mess, and it takes a long time and a lot of graphite, and it smudges on the side of your hand. If you're doing something like in a space this big, it's much easier to sort of make areas of light and dark and gray. And so it's easier to manipulate your values in a small picture. The problem that I find with values is that when I was first thinking about learning to sort of draw, somebody taught me to think about light and dark this way, right? That there's dark, and then there's this slowly shading to white. And your goal, right, is out there, is with your pencil and your little blending tool, is to smoothly blend these things, right? And so, if you've ever been in one of these classes where you're going to shade a sphere, right? So they draw a sphere and then they carefully put all the shadows on it, and then a cone, and then a cylinder, and it's all about sort of smoothly blending these tones together, right? I think this is a terrible way to learn how to shade, to draw shadows, because we really don't see that out there. Yeah, maybe every once in a while there's some big super smooth object. Right? But even looking at a tree trunk, it's not a perfectly smooth cylinder. There are little angles and facets in it as it goes around. And so on most real things, when you look at what the sunlight does on them, is on that tree trunk, it's going to go from sunlight, 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 darkness. Because there's a slight change in the angle. The changes in the shadows that you see on real objects are made by changes in the surface planes of that object. So where you are seeing those changes in those shadows, that is an indication of a change in the surface plane of the object that you're looking at. So if I pay attention to the shapes that are made by those changes in planes, I'm going to be able to carve this object. So rather than getting my blending tool out and getting, what a lot of people do is here's my rock, right? And what people will notice that it's shady on this side, and so what they do is they start getting lighter and 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 lighter. And they're going to leave some sort of zone out here. That's where my highlight is, right? It's this sort of smooth transition. No, it's not what we see. Right? So instead, this is the way that I think about shadows. Some parts are dark, some parts are light, and some parts are in between. It's a simple 3-zone way of thinking about shadows. But what I do when I do this is I'm out there, I'm looking at, let's say I've got the same rock, right? I'm going to say, right, let's say if my sunlight is coming from this direction, I'm going to look at what shape is actually made by that shadow on the bottom. And I'm going to look at that shadow zone as a shape. I'm going to then look at the zone where the highlight is as an actual shape. And very, very lightly with my pencil, I'm going to draw that in. And then what I do is I put dark in here. I put light in there. And my rock actually has edges and angles and is carved by what I drew. And the reason is that I've gotten the shape of the shadow, the shape of the highlight, and consequently, that gives me the shape of this part in between, rather than just this smooth blending from light to dark. Sometimes what I'll also do when I'm done with that is I can also, if I want to get, this is usually where I stop. Sometimes if I want to get really fancy, I will think of, can I add an accent shadow? I mean, an accent dark. Like I'll look at it and say, actually this part right here, where you meet the ground, that's where, boom, I'm really going to punch in some dark. Or this one also has a crack in it that comes across it that's really dark. Alright? And I might punch in some of these sort of accent darks. But just a little bit of that goes a long way. Right? This is usually where I stop my drawings. If I have a rock that is, this really big thing, and it ends up, mostly being, say, gray here, some middle shade of gray, or mostly white, what I will sometimes do is then look for, can I make some other sort of value judgment in here, and perhaps put in an intermediate between these two, or an intermediate between these two, but usually I don't need to do that. And I don't think I ever, am putting in this many values. It's just like thinking of that sort of infinite number of layers of detail in a drawing. I can think of how it's going to be in the foreground, the middle ground, and the background, but having 1,000 different levels of detail going back is going to overwhelm me. Let's take a look at a real photograph, how this approach might apply to it. Alright, I'm going to just use this rock right down here. It is roughly, well, not at all like that, okay, but let's say it is. Alright, there's my rock. Look at what the shadow does. It's going to come narrow, comes out, down, over, up, over, down. I will often talk out loud as I am putting these things to make myself over, down, because each time it is making a direction change, that is a decision that I have to make. I really want to highlight where I'm making those individual decisions. Most of the highlight on this part is this whole top part of the rock here. So I just have a light, I've got a sort of small zone of intermediate, and I have my dark. I have my intermediate, right? And my highlight there. because I'm looking at each of those shapes, that's going to carve my rock for me. That's very, very different than this sort of smooth blending approach. I also find if I'm narrowing the range of values, it helps me, be able to make a small, quick sketch. On your piece of paper, draw yourself a box this big, right? And see if you can make we're going to take, let's just take a couple minutes and make it really small, right? And see if you can make a tiny little landscapito of this, squint at it, and try to get sort of simplify it to white, a light gray, and a dark gray. If you only could do 3 values on a small little sketch. Again, if you go big, you're going to be here all day. All right? But just sort of simplify this in your head to, you might try even squinting at it. Sometimes when you squint at it, the differences between light and dark pop out a little bit better. The nice thing about keeping your value range simple is that it forces you to make real decisions of where am I going to put that gray. You end up really looking at, well, ouch. For me, what I might do is that this zone here. And that might be my light gray. And that my light gray. That dark, that white. Different people will make those boundaries in different places. But you want to be intentional about why you're making that boundary between there. I also recommend not really pushing hard when you're making the lines that are going to be the boundaries between the lights and the darks. When you shade those in, you don't want those lines to really pop out as an element of the picture. How many people are done? So for people who are done, hold up with your fingers how big your landscape is. Just sort of measure it, the length. Okay. For people who are still working on it, show me with your fingers how big your landscape is. Okay. So often, the larger the landscape, the more time it takes. So just remember, you want to be done quickly. It's that you're sort of working with the square of the linear dimensions of what you're doing. Smaller is faster, is easier. Sometimes when you're looking at photographs, when you're looking at the real world around you, it is confusing to be able to sort of pick out the difference between light and dark, because it's confused with color. We're seeing it's a blue flower, it's a yellow flower, it's a red flower, but what is really the light part, what is really the dark part? There's color and there's this whole sort of light-dark thing. If you only saw in black and white, it would be a lot easier. That's why look through a red filter when I am trying to, well, I've got a little landscape, let's see, over another landscape. If I want to turn that to, now the difference between dark and light really pops out, right? I carry a little slide frame like this in my sketch bag. And what I do with this is two things. One, when I'm initially trying to figure out what my composition is going to be, I'm going to pop this out and look through this and use it to frame my shot. It's a lot easier than holding my fingers up because it's automatically making a rectangle. I can change the size of that rectangle or the shape of that rectangle by obscuring part of it with my thumb or my fingers like that, make it into a skinny rectangle, right? Or I can make it into a square if I want. But what I'll do is I'll hold this around. I can zoom in on things by holding it closer to my subject, or I can pan back and get a larger field by moving this in and out this way. So this is a great tool for sort of thinking about, you know, the three bears, thinking about the grid, and framing that shot. But also, if I'm trying to get values and think of what are the lights and darks in my picture, this is a really, really useful tool to be able to do that. And so what I've got is one of these for each of you, and you get to bring this home with you. What I did with mine is I made a little holster for it out of some paper and some duct tape, so I can slip it into that and it doesn't get scratched and beat up and it lasts a long time. The red in here is a piece of gel from stage lighting. And it really does a great job of only letting the red through. And then you've got your own little plastic slide frame. What we're going to do is, just as an experiment, we're going to bring these outdoors with us and take a moment looking around through this. All right? Before we do, I want to point out one kind of interesting feature of the way that it works. All right? Here you go. You're welcome. For each of you. 1, 2, 3.
I've got tons of these.
Oh, okay. Alright. So you just sort of look around the room or look out the window, you hold this up, and you notice how you can't really see what color objects are.
Yeah.
So it takes color, all you're seeing is dark and light.
Awesome.
Wow.
Isn't that cool? This really helps you see contrast and value. However, there's one thing that this does that is weird, and you have to know what that is. Otherwise, they can confuse you. There's one really weird thing. And so put the slide down for just a moment. All right, so you're not looking through your slide. So here's the photograph. I took this photograph and I brought it into Photoshop and I got rid of all the color. All right? And if you just squint at this without your slide frame, you notice that the value here in the sky is basically the same thing. You kind of squint on the same level of darkness, right? Now, take your slide frame up and look at it through that.
Blue sky. Sort of works with blue, like oppositely to make a darker values.
Yes. What it's going to do is it's going to make blues darker. And you have to know that about looking through these. So as long as you know that this is going to make my blues darker, It's an incredibly useful tool to seeing value, but it can really confuse you if you're not aware of that. Yeah?
I was actually just looking at that tablecloth through the filter, and you can't really tell the blue in the tablecloth stripes. If you look at it,
Oh, yeah.
you can tell the design, you can't tell what color it is. It just makes it very dark.
Yeah, it turns them black, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Or some of those blue things, it turns to blue and black lines. Yes?
That's okay.
I was looking at the trees and noticed that the one that's going right, look at your film, it looks like it has less detail.
Interesting.
Yeah, I see less shadow on the ground, on the black and white one.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder if there are some blues in the shadows that are being generated to extra blacks with this and this one. That's a really interesting observation.
Look at this box with the red on it.
Oh,
Red turns white and the red's
Yeah, they make it a lot.
and also, don't look at it, because take a look at this, right? See the red and the white there?
Ah, weird. Oh, yeah.
Whoa! Let's bring these outside and just take a look around. Ways of getting, a lot at ways of getting depth into our drawing. The value of thinking of that foreground, middle ground, and background as areas where you're going to draw differently. And also some tools to help us see values in the landscape and be able to copy those values down. It's really interesting as a study for a while to say, I'm going to do some drawings, and what I'm going to do is just I'm just going to emphasize values, lightness and darkness, rather than the line. We often get really wrapped around the line, but as an experiment, you might play with just values in a drawing and not be as fussy about what the lines are doing. The little landscapes can also help you do that. This but at the end of this month, last Sunday of this month, we have our field trip. We're going to be going to the Ring Mountain Preserve in Tiburon. It's an amazing place if you've never been there. There are Indian petroglyphs carved into rocks. There are shell mounds. There are mortar pits. There's grasslands and woodlands. The grasslands have these some amazing rock formations that stick up and are really, really fun to draw. And the grasslands also contain the rare Calicortus tiburonensis. It's this wildflower that just occurs in this one place out on the Tiburon Peninsula. It was not discovered for the longest time because it blooms after most of the botanists have turned in, right? So the blooming season for most plants ends, and then Calicortus tiburonensis pops up. And so there's a chance that we're going to be able to see that out there as everything else is drying up. It's a really, really fun place, and I want to encourage you folks to come and join us on that field trip.
Please, what is the name of the place you talked about?
It's the Ring Mountain Preserve. If you go to my website, which is johnmuirlaws.com, you can, and you click on I've got a calendar which has all my events on it. You can click on it, it'll bring up a Google map of where it is,
Okay.
and some other resources about how to get there and how to explore.
Where to spend the night before there? And where to spend the night before there?
Yeah, so this is just in Marin County, so close by. So it's within an hour drive from here, I think. So, there's one last thought that I have for you on doing your sketches. And that is, when you're doing a landscape drawing, photographers will spend a lot of time looking around on the landscape and looking at light and looking at composition and these sort of things, and then they bring up their camera and go click. And in that one instant, they get that picture. Very often what happens is that we sketchers, we come up to a place and we've been hiking for a while and we go, oh wow, this is really pretty. oh, here's a good place to sit down. We find the most comfortable place to sit down. We point ourselves towards wherever it's in front of us, in the most comfortable place, which usually means that the sunlight is now directly behind us, right? Washing out all the shadows on what is in front of us. Meanwhile, our photographer friends are looking right and left, getting that glancing light, right? We're just sitting where it's comfortable. And then we cross our legs, pull out our sketchbook, and we start drawing whatever's directly in front of us. We actually spend, even though we spend more time making the drawing, we spend less time composing it than the photographer. Because we just do, we clunk ourselves down, we say like, I'm gonna be drawing here for a long time, I might as well be comfortable. Here's the most comfortable place. So there's tons of drawings done from benches that are comfortable, that are pointing out at uninteresting landscapes, right? But we drew it just because we found the bench. Right, now I'll do a landscape. So I really want to encourage people to, when you are maybe holding up that slide frame, start thinking like a photographer. Compose your shot, right? Before you're now going to spend, some time sitting down doing your drawing, right? Spend at least as much time as the photographer did composing that, and have fun. Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank you very much. I'm going to be